Well, joining me now on the Real, Raw and Relevant show, it's my pleasure to welcome a guest for the show, Pat Buckley. Welcome along, Pat.
Hey, Lockie, good to see you.
I read from your brief bio, you're pretty good at actually not saying too much on your Facebook. I thought I'd stalk you on Facebook and get, how people love to share how amazing and all the you just put real simple, it's this. You say founder and educator at Amp for Life. That's it. There's nothing else. So welcome to the show. I'm getting that when I ask you these questions that we've already been talking about, that we'll get a bit to know you a bit more. So thank you for being with us. Before we get started, how about for people to understand why I'm talking to you maybe, and we go back a little bit and start a conversation from a beginning point. Can you share a little with us about your life when you were younger and growing up? Maybe that'd be a good place to start.
Sure. I was born in the north of England in 1965. I have two brothers. I've got a twin brother. He's the ugly one. No, just kidding. I've got an older brother. And we were born into a home in the north of England where alcoholism was very much a part of our day-to-day. So back in those days, the family decided, or mum and dad decided, right, we're going to move to New Zealand and start again. And so we hopped on a boat called the Rangi Toto and sailed down to Auckland, which took about 6 weeks.
Wow.
Moved out to a town called Howick, where it was a wonderful place to grow up. But the reality of it was the only thing that had changed was the weather. Dad's behaviour and his drinking and his lifestyle were exactly the same. And so living in a home with alcoholism and the variables that come with that created a very unnerving and unsettling place to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
So at the age of about 8, my mum came into our room one day and said, I need to tell you boys that your father's decided that he's leaving us, that he doesn't want us, that he wants to go and live his own life. And as a child, all I perceived that was, my dad doesn't love me. He doesn't want me. And recognizing that as through a child's lens, I perceived basically I wasn't wanted and started down a path of bad behavior and wrong choices, and very quickly ended up in a world of addiction. At the age of 12, I started smoking cannabis. I would sneak out to parties as a young boy and end up in places where there was excessive alcohol. And when you're drinking excessively, you're no longer thinking clearly anymore. And one night I remember a bunch of my friends, one of them specifically turned around and offered me a joint of marijuana and said, try this. And without thinking and wanting to be a part of what my friends were doing, I ended up crossing a line and ingesting cannabis, thinking I'll just smoke a bit of weed, drink a bit of alcohol, but I'll definitely never do anything else. Well, within a very short time, there was all sorts being offered, LSD, pills. And for the next couple of years, that continued to evolve. And then at 14, I ended up associating with a bunch of friends that were using very dangerous and addictive narcotics, IV drugs. And again, I went to a friend's house one night and he offered me some, and I thought, well, I'll just try it once. It can't be that bad. Well, it was that bad. And after a week or two of using narcotics, I became addicted to these types of drugs, and then ended up getting caught in a world I couldn't get out of for the next 16 years.
It's one of the things that, like, your story amazes me, is because I think there's a disconnect these days with people thinking that this stuff's out there, but how do people get a hold of it? It just seems so readily available. Is it the same then as now, do you think, with having access to these substances?
I think the access is even greater in today's world, especially with the flooding of the market with methamphetamine. There's far more designer drugs available. There's synthetic drugs. There's you name it. And unfortunately, New Zealand market has created a demand for it. And so as such, these drug dealers and these often overseas underworld people are quite happy to provide that to a public which demands.
So I've been obviously reading, looking at your website, Amp for Life. I'll post a link to that later for people, they can check it out for themselves. But I see from your work that you're obviously not shy in sharing what you've shared with us now, and obviously more to your story. I've read an article that was in Authentic magazine where you were interviewed for that, and you share a lot of background openly, which is obviously the what. So that's all the things that have happened that you've been involved in. So the question, I guess, is the why. Why are you taking the time to put yourself out there and share your story about drugs and alcohol and substance abuse? Why do you do it? Why do you share that with the public?
Well, unfortunately, in today's world, our kids are overloaded with things they're negotiating and very complex decisions along the way. And so my brother and I sat back years ago, and our wives sat down, and we thought, how can I use all of that negativity and that brokenness and that pain? How can we use that to save one life, to influence one life, not to go down the road that I did? And so, with that, armed with that knowledge, we stepped out of the boat, so to speak, and we offered our programs to schools, local schools initially in Tauranga and the Western Bay. And eventually we recognized that, wow, this was an incredibly powerful medium and a program which connected with the kids at a real, authentic, and genuine level.
Mm-hmm.
And kids identify truth. They may lack a lot of things, but they identify authenticity and truth. And when it's spoken from a heart of love, they recognize that. And as such, that's why we didn't want to waste all of that experience and that knowledge and shelve it. We actually wanted to use it as a tool to help others not go down the road that I did.
Yeah. And in part of those conversations, you are very open about the your faith, that being an aspect of helping you in the change and navigating coming out of that world. I would easily want to know, and I think most of us out there want to know, how do you incorporate that sensibly and realistically in these conversations, especially in public? Because not a lot of people want to hear about people's faith, or if you mention the word Jesus, everyone gets upset. So how do you deal with that? I'm really curious on how you inject that into the conversation respectfully, and that people still want to listen to you.
Well, there's several aspects to that. The first thing is Māori use this term hauora, which is the four different elements of humanity: social, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Wairua, they call it. And so in dealing with anything, you've got to deal with a person as a whole. And so we wanted to express that without, if people ask me about my faith, I will speak about it, unless, of course, it's not brought up in the conversation, and then I just stick to the subject. But
Mm-hmm.
I often talk about forgiveness and my journey, because that was very integral in my journey of healing, was to deal with the forgiveness with my father. And so I can speak about my faith in a practical, tangible way, how I dealt with it, and bring it into the conversation in that aspect. Also honoring your parents and being a good person as such, and whole different dynamics to the faith, rather than just talking about Jesus specifically.
Mm-hmm.
See, because unless my faith is practical and real, it's just words on a page. And so I want to translate that into, what does that look like in today's world, rather than preaching at them or trying to convert them or patronizing them. I simply want to talk about how it was real in my specific case.
Now, you mentioned about it being real for you. You also credit your faith as actually helping turn you around in your life. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Right. And so, yeah.
Sorry.
So, can you briefly just tell us how that happened for you? I guess because in Christian circles they love to say, "Let's share your testimony," and I feel it's on some level it's quite a loaded statement. People feel like they've got to give you the goriest details
Sure.
to help justify what's happened next. But I'm really curious about that moment. What was the moment that you decided you wanted to do this thing where people say, "I just want to follow Jesus"? What was that like for you?
Well, there were several factors that came into play on that. The first was that my two brothers and mother had become believers many years before. And I said to myself, if God is real, I'll see it in my family. Other people can con you, but not your own family. Why? Because you know them so well. And I watched in their faith journey over a 10 to 15 year period as God restored each one of them individually and as a whole. And I saw the reality of that faith. For me, it came a little bit later, apart from the intervention from my family who were praying for me. In 1995, I had a series of overdoses where I clinically died 3 times. And in that experience, several of those encounters, I had what you call a near-death experience,
Okay.
where I had a conversation with God, and another experience where I woke up and there was an angelic presence in the toilet after I'd overdosed on these specific drugs. The last time I overdosed, I was clinically dead for 25 minutes. I had a friend of mine pumping on my chest and trying to resuscitate me without success. The ambulance arrived 25 minutes later, started taking over CPR, and as the ambulance arrived, I just stood up and I heard what I know to be the audible voice of God speak to me, and very personally and very gently said this. He said, "Pat, I love you, son,
Mm-hmm.
but unless you surrender your life to Jesus, you'll be dead in 3 weeks." And I tell you what, it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. Every cell of my being resonated with that fact that somehow, some way, the creator of life had stepped out of his world into mine and was trying to reveal himself and how much he loved me and how much he had a plan for my life. And I recognized even then I still had a choice. And I was smart enough, I remember going home, and I was smart enough to recognize I was playing a game of Russian roulette I was about to lose unless I made a choice, because the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result.
Mm.
And I knew that I had to change. I had to try something. I tried every other thing. I'd been in mental hospitals. I was fast heading toward prison. And I recognized that unless I didn't stop, I'd be dead within weeks. And so that was my introduction to the faith realm.
So it's very real for you. It's a moment that you can obviously look back on and go, I know exactly when that happened for me, which I think is really, really important. And I guess it'd be nice to say to everybody that that's available for anybody, whatever they're going through. Now, I want to get some your opinions on a couple of questions, a couple of statements that I've already sent you. Now, talking about drugs and alcohol and the dangers of them, that's not new. People have been talking about that for years. The thing that I find fascinating is with all that's spoken about it, and why do people still gravitate to drugs and alcohol? Why is it such a draw card when people are really struggling? Why do you think that is?
People want the quick fix, Lockie. People
Mm-hmm.
want the pain to go away. They're not willing to make the hard call and the hard choices and face their pain. And the one thing I recognized years ago in my own life, unless I face my pain and walk through it, I will never get true healing. People have been self-medicating and doing it for thousands of years with alcohol, with other opiates and the likes of drugs that they found from the earth, cannabis and the likes of. People want a quick fix, a temporary solution to a deeper problem. And
Mm.
unfortunately, as we know, it doesn't work like that. You have to go through a process in order to truly get healing and move on.
And see, this is why I find this fascinating and scary as well, because it's out there. Don't do drugs. We probably all grew up hearing you shouldn't do drugs, but yet there's that moment for many of us where you get presented with that opportunity and you've identified that you don't want to deal with your stuff or what's gone on in your life. You're looking for another way out of it, and it seems like a simple way. It's handed to you. I know from growing up in the world that I grew up in, it wasn't hard to find drugs.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Temptation's always available.
Yep, there's always someone at a party that turned up. There was always the house that someone talked about. I still remember when I was a teenager, I grew up in Invercargill, and we heard as a bunch of young people, hopefully my mum doesn't thump me for this one. She doesn't do that, don't worry. Everyone heard through the grapevine there was this very specific house on a street that was going to be a tinny house that night. And me and my mate, we drove around because we thought it was interesting. And the number of cars all queued up outside, we're like, we've got to get out of here because it was just so obvious something was going down there, but how quickly it got out there. It resonates with something inside of you that you want to look at it. Maybe there's that curiosity. We want to experience things and see what is it really that bad? Is that something, I suppose, that for young people these days, and I hate saying it like an old person, but for teenagers, They want to experience things for themselves, and they've got this pain factor that's going on. How do you find talking with young people about this? What are they saying to you about their experiences and why they still want to head down this path or are attracted to it?
There's a combination of factors, Lockie. There's a combination of puberty kicking in and curiosity. You've
Mm.
got emotional problems potentially at home. There's an old saying, give me a child until they're 7 and I'll show you the man. And what I've come to understand in my experience of dealing with the young people over 20 years is that when things go bad at home, it can manifest later on in at-risk behaviours, especially drug and alcohol and a whole lot of other things that they shouldn't be playing around with. You see, kids don't have the lens that an adult does. They don't have the cognitive understanding and the ability to process, and so they perceive it through a child's perspective. And often the things that happen are life-defining situations, whether it's a broken home, domestic violence, lack of self-confidence, uh, what do you call it, body image, a whole lot of other things. These kids are looking, and when they see this false image of what was proposed on social media,
Mm.
often many people end up seeing themselves as fail, and they want a quick fix. They want a way out of it because the pain that they're carrying and negotiating is often too complex, and they just want a fast answer.
Well, it leads to the segue into this question. Do you think things are better, worse, the same for young people from when you grew up and what your experiences?
I think there's a lot more complex challenges, especially uh, many voices vying for their attention as well. And there's so much that they have to negotiate, whether it's drug use, pornography, substance abuse, bullying, peer pressure, relationships, binge drinking, body image, social media, cutting, vaping, uh, family violence, divorce, at-risk behavior. There's so many things now and so many voices vying for their
Mm.
attention. Uh, Whereas families generally are so busy in today's world as well, even sitting around a table and having a conversation or having a meal together is a rare thing in today's world. And so these young people are having to negotiate, and add to that COVID and the anxiety and stuff that we're seeing now. Like my role, I work for a St. John ambulance, and the amount of young people that are negotiating with anxiety and uh, mental health issues is frightening.
And I'm glad you brought that up because it was something we've talked about on some previous shows. The prediction was a year and a half ago that that might be the case, that we'd see an increase, and then the stats and what you're talking about is certainly proving that out. We've identified there's obviously problems and that young people are having all these challenges, just like actually adults as well. But I guess the next logical question is, well, what do we do? So is AMP for Life your mechanism to try and address this for young people specifically? Is that what that's for?
Yeah, look, we've been running programs. It's 20 years we've been operating as of August this year, and our passion is to provide programs which are real and relevant and give answers to the things that they're negotiating and give them the tools to equip and empower them to take responsibility for their own life. They can't change anyone else. They can only take responsibility for themselves.
That's
And
good. Yeah.
so we're all about empowering them to take ownership and to take onus of personal responsibility to make change. And really, before they charge in, to back the truck up and think about, how is this decision going to affect me? And so we work in a local capacity in the Western Bay of Plenty with local schools. Had relationship for 20 years with local schools, and then we travel the country extensively from Dunedin through to Northland, basically providing programs and uh, presentations which are relevant and real and connected
Mhm.
with the audience, because they get flooded with information. They don't
Yeah.
need more information. They need something that they can connect with, that they can relate with right then and there, which is going to help them on their journey and sow principles and seeds of truth which can carry them over during those challenging years.
That's good, Pat. Now, I've got one final question for you. Before I share that, I'll just mention again, we're going to share links to Pat's work on our website and bits and pieces for you after the show. So if you want to check out Amp for Life, please check that out and maybe see how you can support the work that Pat and the team are doing. The last question I have for you is, again, let's go back to personal. How do you look after yourself emotionally, spiritually, physically for the role that you're in? It's a question I've been asking a lot of the people I've been talking to recently. What do you do to look after you?
I make sure I have a wife and 5 children that keep me very honest. And so she'll let me out, give me a leave pass once a month, and I go out and do my stuff for a week or two, and then I'll come home and balance myself through serving and loving on my family, spending time with them, quality time. I love hosting people around at my home for a meal and just hanging out and doing life together with others. I'm all about relationship. And so for me, spiritually in my role, I spend that first part of my day always with the Lord and His Word before I set anything else in the day, because that for me is a non-negotiable. Without that, I can't do what I do, because my faith is foundational, everything that stems from that. Emotionally, I've got some good mentors, people like Graham Preston, who founded Bethlehem College. He's been a mentor and a friend and a board member for 20 years. I've got 2 brothers that also mentor and guide me and support me very closely. We're really tight as a family. And so having that family support, having that quality time with my wife and my kids brings balance, and actually allowing people to speak into my life regularly to just make sure that I'm doing okay, and just asking those courageous questions and those challenging questions. Am I doing okay? Is there anything I need support with, and things like that?
Cool. You've certainly got a bit of a plan for looking after yourself.
That's why I've lasted so long, Lockie. I've got to make sure that if I don't look after myself, nobody else will.
It's very, very wise. I'd encourage people to rewind that little section there and just scribble down the summary points of things that Pat's doing. You mentioned a number of things about, having people speak into your life and your boundaries and what's values to you. They're always really helpful for everybody. Hey, thank you so much, Pat, for your time. Really appreciate you talking with us today.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks so much for your time, Lockie.